Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Malcolm X, starring Denzel Washington and directed by Spike Lee. Now, because I've never seen this movie before I get into this, I did go back to Black Klansman, the movie that Spike made with Denzel's son, John David Washington, and that I still remain, it still is in my thought that it's a very good movie, and it is. So let's get into Malcolm X. We open with an American flag being burned to an X during the opening credits because of white supremacy and beating up on African American folks, which is not cool to begin with, as we start the movie in the war years in Boston, where we get introduced to Shorty, played by the movie's director Spike Lee, walking to a barber shop where Malcolm X, played by Denzel Washington, is getting a haircut by Shorty, although he's named something different. I forgot what the name was. Until his hair burns and it suddenly shrinks, which looks pretty damn random, as Malcolm walks out like Shorty in the same exact way. As he explains his family, as a kid he was attacked by the Ku Klux Klan because of his father, who happens to be a priest for the African American folks. And Denzel's performance is terrific, and I really like him as Malcolm X. Malcolm and Shorty go to a club to dance with some girls as they go crazy with their dance moves until they get out of breath, which are very good shots, as this movie is well shot throughout. And Malcolm meets a white woman named Sophia, whom invites him back to the dance floor without his date Laura, played by Teresa Randall, as he sends her name, and the date's mother doesn't approve of Malcolm. As she gets home and he goes back to smooch Sophia up all near the ocean, and Malcolm doesn't like a girl who talks too much. As the cinematography is also very good, while Malcolm and Shorty play out of the park, which seems like fun. And I like Spike Lee's take on Malcolm X, as he's a ladies' man at first, but he suddenly becomes a hero of the African American folks. Malcolm is fed by Sophia, as he's led to believe she's a bad person because they've just met, and we get to a place at the beach where Malcolm is hanging out with Laura, with flashback to a white lady threatening Malcolm's family, and he gets moved away from his family to a detention home, and he gets called the N-word all the time, as he acts like it was a name. And we move on to Malcolm working at a restaurant where he's a cook, and they listen to a boxing match, and his boss Charlie comes in and says there's a lot of hungry customers, and Malcolm serves the customers, and he celebrates the new heavyweight champion of the world, Joe Louis. And can some of this be dialed down in the editing room floor? Yes, because this movie is quite too long. Malcolm goes to a club and gets picked on by a jerk who messes up his suit and puts him down until Malcolm beats his ass up for doing so, and the jerk gets thrown out of the club, and he gets a drink until suddenly he gets called upon by a mobster named West Indian Archie, played by Delroy Lindo, whom talks with Malcolm about how he's a man to know, and Archie continues to talk with Malcolm as they try to on some suits together, and they check each other. As Archie has a gun he ends up giving to Malcolm, and he does some mob things and gets home where Malcolm and Sophia do some drugs together. And this is going nowhere in the plot, but I like the movie as a biopic of a hero of the African American folks. Malcolm sees Laura giving $5 to someone as a waitress acting like a private detective, and she should have married her own business, with Malcolm almost slapping her, and Archie stops him from doing so, and they sit as Malcolm asks Archie for his money he owes him, as he gives it and walks away, as sidekick Sammy disrespects Malcolm on how much he's a dead man. And do we need any of the mob scenes? Absolutely not. While Malcolm is approached during the show by Archie and tells him there's 3 guns on him, and tells him to walk or else he's dead, and he runs the hell out of there, and boy oh boy, Denzel runs rather quick. And we flash back to when his family was threatened once again by the Ku Klux Klan, as their house burns and scares the racists away until his father died from a train running him over. And this half slows the movie way down, but when I get to an hour and a half into the movie, it kicks in the gear. Malcolm starts a revolution and hires some people like Sophia, Shorty, and Rudy, whom the audience just met, amongst others, as Malcolm points a gun and plays a game with Rudy where he points a gun at each other, and Malcolm almost kills Rudy to death, but he ends up alive by the end of the scene, and we move on to them breaking into a nice house. And what does this got to do with the history of Malcolm X is beyond me. Some of this could be in the editing room floor, as this is taking too long. And to get to the point, the audience knows as history, and Malcolm gets a haircut by Shorty, but the water doesn't run for whatever reason, so he uses the toilet water, which is gross, and serves 2 years in prison in burglary. And this is dragging, and I want to know about the history of Malcolm X as a hero, in which so far I'm not seeing it, but give it about another 15-20 minutes and it'll work then. Malcolm and Shorty are in prison as the guards beat up on Malcolm for forgetting a number, which doesn't make sense, because if he forgot it, and puts him in a dark place for 10 days, where they offer him water and cigarettes, and someone telling him Jesus is his friend, as he asks what he has done for him, while Malcolm suffocates in there, and eventually he remembers his number and gets out of the dark place, which felt predictable, while a man gives Malcolm something to drink and offers him a way to get out of prison. Malcolm declines and stays in prison and becomes the savior and he is in the history books, thanks to the man that offered him a way out, and the prison scene is slowly paced. Malcolm talks with the man that offered him a way out, and he teaches him to read a book which is a dictionary, as he learns the definitions to words written by the white men in the world. And day by day goes by as Malcolm sees the baseball game, the other prisoners play, as one of them is the next Jackie Robinson, and the man asks Malcolm who he is, as he brings up how he's a nation. And they continue talking about how some white men are devils, and which I'm not. And Malcolm decides to not touch another white person ever again, nor will he ever lie, cheat, or steal. And Malcolm becomes a better man like he was in the history books, which felt inspirational. Malcolm gets a letter from someone famous as he sees pain in the man, and then feels like being a better person than who he was, and starts to pray for a better life out of prison, and he shaves his head bald. And Shorty is transferred upstate as he writes a letter and becomes a better person, while Malcolm asks a question in church class and says Jesus wasn't always white. And Malcolm gets out of prison and meets Elijah Muhammad as he resurrects Malcolm, and this is when the movie starts to kick into gear, as he becomes an inspirational man. He is, as he meets Brother Earl, as he goes to the street and to inspire African American folks to be who they are around with other people like him. And I'm liking this movie more than I did in the first half. Malcolm continues to make speeches about how black is beautiful, which is great acting by Denzel, who is tremendous, and his performance is what holds this movie together, in my opinion, as he learns Sophia is married to for the money, thanks to Shorty, as he comes to Archie's place, who can talk and he can barely move. And we move on to Malcolm making more speeches and inspiring people, and meets Sister Betty Shabazz, played by Angela Bassett, with a very good performance, as she asks him to speak in her classroom, and he accepts, and their charisma is well done by Denzel and Angela Bassett. Malcolm gets to know Betty at a museum and sits next to a statue of elephants and have some ice cream, and continuously get to know each other as people until we get news of Brother John getting arrested by the cops. For what reason? It's never said, except for his skin color, which is racist, as Malcolm goes to the police station and his protesters demand Brother John to be out of the prison as he's injured and is taken to the hospital. And then they walk to the hospital wondering if Brother John will be fine, and we learn he will live, which is a relief. Whew! While the cops follow their every movement, and the African American folks want justice, and Malcolm sends them away, and they want to do something about the cops being abusive to African American folks. And this is a powerful scene with the protesters led by Malcolm. Malcolm is asked by Benjamin he wants to be a Muslim, as Malcolm brings him in the Muslim support, as we move on to a scene with Malcolm and an elder drinking alcohol, with the elder making a speech to him as Malcolm calls Betty and he proposes her hand in marriage over the phone, which feels rather strange as he loves her, and they get together and she feels sorry for him and she shouldn't be as serious as he is, and they get married in a private kind of way. And we move on to Malcolm making a speech for the African American folks, and his speeches are powerful, and the acting in that scene was well done by Denzel. While he and Betty have a child of their own, and that was quick, but I'm still liking the movie at this point. Malcolm brings up in one of his speeches how African Americans have been slaves for the whites for 400 years, which is too long as it is, while we see footage of Martin Luther King Jr., who is also fighting for their rights, and Malcolm brings up how God doesn't want to hate the white man, but loves themselves as people. And Malcolm goes on a talk show where he talks about the X in his name and how he's the man to stop slavery and racism. And he talks about the N-word, which is not a word I like to take lightly because it's so damn racist. And he says powerful words on the TV and gets interviewed for the news as he has a plane to catch, as a white woman says, what can she do to help? And he says nothing. And suddenly walks away and talks to some college students about what Elijah Muhammad taught him in life over the world. And the dialogue is well written by Arnold Pearl and Spike Lee, as it's saying some powerful things, while the costume design is very good, as it was nominated for an Oscar for it as well, and Denzel's performance, which is great anyways. A man asks Malcolm if he's Elijah's pimp and disrespects him, and he gets back home to Betty. And his son, as Betty says he's in trouble, or his kid rather, and Betty says he's in trouble, she talks with Malcolm, and he brings up how he wants peace with her and their son Miles. As Malcolm and Betty have a discussion about Elijah and how things they say about him are lies, as Malcolm is aware of it, but is Betty and Malcolm might be as Betty assumes Malcolm might be Elijah's puppet, which is an impression I'm getting at this point in the movie, and Betty just wants Malcolm to be safe, which is a very good point, and that piece of acting by Angela Bassett is well done. Malcolm enters the house of a sister who has a 2-year-old girl who happens to be Elijah, whose father happens to be Elijah, and she tells him to leave Elijah, and he goes to Elijah and chats with him about his past, and he says they're all lies, and he's been accused of other crimes in his life, and he tells Malcolm to be careful while Malcolm decides to leave him from his involvements, as Malcolm's life has started to shatter out of betrayal, which is something he feels, and he does some work to teach some people things from the Bible, as he's upset from making his own speech about the incident, and Malcolm says something bad in a statement to Elijah in the newspaper and gets punished for it, and this could have been in the editing room floor as well. Betty gets a call from publicity from Malcolm, and she says to stop calling the house, and Malcolm gets the phone and hangs it up and learns one of his own men he was going to put in a wire on his car, but he says he can't do it because he loves Malcolm as a confession, and Malcolm says to go back to his father and calls a press conference about how he said bad things about Elijah, and says he'll speak more of his words and thinks his own thoughts, and also says to work together as citizens of the United States of America, and says whites can help them but can't join them. As Malcolm goes to Egypt and is greeted by Egyptians shops in a village in Egypt and talks with them, asks a couple of them to the pyramids, and a couple of white folks follow him around like they're in the CIA as he's taken to pyramids, which looks amazing, by the way, and maybe one day I'll get there on my bucket list of travels. as he writes to Betty, and she reads his letter to her, to the world, as Egypt looks very well shot in this movie until he gets back to America. After a prayer somewhere in Egypt, Malcolm gets back on the plane home to America and is asked to go to the United Nations to settle the African American folks for their civil rights, as he goes on the TV and gets his face in the newspapers and talks about defending themselves as a rude man is upset by it. And we move on to Malcolm with a rifle as he gets death threats from people all over the world and tries to sleep at night, but he can't, as he's being threatened by half the world, and his house gets on fire and is threatened by someone who gets on the TV as they're luckily safe. And he threatens every single person that threatened them, and that was a scary situation, but well shot, as it happens to some people in the world, which isn't a smart idea, but this movie is executed quite well. Malcolm gets to a hotel, and someone calls someone by the name of Earl, Brother Earl, while getting some work done, as the call is getting wired, and he says it's not safe for Malcolm and Earl to be near each other, and says they don't want other African Americans killing one another, as a couple of hitmen come to his hotel as Malcolm doesn't pick up the phone, and Betty and the kids get death threats by other African American folks, as does Malcolm, and Malcolm calls Betty and tells her to not pick up the phone anymore, and has bodyguards answering the phones for her. And the kids, as Malcolm advises Betty to not come to the press conference the next day, as his hotel room is wired as his call by the FBI. And has anybody ever heard of privacy? Because they're not getting any. And we move on to the next day, where Malcolm drives his family to the press conference, as people follow him there while Betty and the kids go to the press conference, and we get the fantastic Spike Lee shot of Malcolm not moving as the camera moves. While all this is really good, but some of it could have been edited down, Malcolm gets word that'll debate whether or not they'll do the press conference today or the next week, as Malcolm doesn't have the next week, and he needs to do this now. And he learns Betty and the kids are there and asks to call for the Reverend to get him there, but they continue to the press conference as he apologizes to the sister for raising his voice to her while he walks outside and makes a speech, until the threatening men come up to Malcolm and shoots him dead and run out of there before security catches them. And unfortunately, Malcolm dies, and from there, like how Martin Luther King was shot dead, and the cops catch the murderers of Malcolm while Betty cries for his life, and the cops come in, and the ambulances quickly get Malcolm to the hospital, and we hear from Elijah to Martin Luther King Jr. about violence towards Malcolm, and we get the scroll from Malcolm himself, and the climax was depressing, but it had to end at some point. But should it be 3 hours and 21 minutes? Let's talk about it in a rating. I'll give this movie a 7.4 out of 10. Denzel's performance is terrific, and I really like him as Malcolm X, and the shots are very good, as this movie is well shot throughout, and the cinematography is very good. And I like Spike Lee's take on Malcolm X, as he feels like a ladies' man at first, but at the end of it, he's a hero to the African-American folks. And can some of this be dialed down in the editing room floor? Yes, because this movie is quite too long, as I pointed out many, many times throughout the review. There were times this went nowhere for the plot, but I like the movie for what it is, which is a biopic of a hero to the African American folks, and the first half slows way the hell down until the movie kicks in the first half, and it moves and it kicks into gear, and the scenes in prison were absolutely slowly paced, but it works. The movie feels inspirational, and Denzel's performance is what holds this movie together, in my opinion. And this is a recommendation for this movie, and director Spike Lee does a fantastic job at telling the story of Malcolm X that didn't work in the first half, but worked better by the second half. But this was a pretty good movie to watch for the history of African Americans and their rights, and Angela Bassett's performance is very good and the charisma between her and Denzel is well done. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with He Got Game. And until then, show enough, you dig?